The mystical experience is one of profound paradox. It occurs within the profound depths of interiority, and yet it often has totally life-altering effects. It seems to impart a sense of eternal truth, though what it means is often utterly beyond all articulation in words. It can come all at once without any effort at all, and sometimes only at long last, after years of extreme effort. Mystical experiences often serve as the foundation stones upon which whole empires of religion are built, and yet the same experience remains as remote as ever, locked away in the vault of time, in the inner reality of pure experience beyond language and logic. And yet, there are mystical experiences so decisive for the trajectory of world experience that they deserve the most sustained and profound analysis possible. Paul, the recent convert to the Messianic Jesus movement, seems to have had just such experiences throughout his lifetime. Sometime after his conversion following a previous mystical experience on the road to Damascus, Paul would enter into an ecstatic state by his own account, in which his Lord, the resurrected Jesus, would give him direction that would alter the course of human history, to go and preach about the messianic and salvific redemption achieved by Jesus the Christ to non-Jews, to spread this otherwise Jewish movement to the wider Gentile world. Paul may have disclosed clues to this world-altering mystical vision some 14 years later while vying for apostolic authority in the community of believers there at Corinth. What he reveals, although elliptically, to be honest, is still shocking. Paul seems to have been a practitioner of an ancient esoteric form of Jewish mysticism in which its adherents ascend and really descend into the palaces of the most holy supernal temple to witness the divine glory upon which the Chariot-Throne of God rests, and in turn to be transformed. The mystic is transformed into a glorified quasi-angelic being. In fact, these elements of Merkavah, or chariot mysticism, may form the basis for the earliest layer of Christian theological speculations there in the work of Paul. Thus, an incredibly ancient, esoteric, and apocalyptic form of Jewish mysticism may very well lie at the foundation of both Paul's preaching to the wider Gentile world and the theological core of the earliest Christian theology. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and also check out my other content on topics in esotericism, including curated playlists. Also, if you want to support this work of providing long-form, accessible, yet scholarly and free content on topics as esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon with a one-time donation via PayPal with the Super Thanks option, or you can even pick up a metal shirt in our merch store. But now, let's turn to Paul the Mystic, a likely adept of the ancient chariot mysticism, that mysticism that perhaps ultimately gave us Christianity. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. To understand this decisive mystical experience, it's best to start at Corinth in the Peloponnese in the mid-50s of the Common Era and work our way back. Paul himself had founded that community there, and it was the first of its kind in a major metropolitan center, thus raising the stakes for its success in Paul's larger agenda. In fact, Paul had lived in the area for about 18 months, it seems, seeding and preaching the message of the early Jesus movement. However, he had recently left across the Aegean to settle at Ephesus when trouble began to brew there at Corinth. Another educated Jew, it seems, Apollos of Alexandria, subsequently settled in the same area to preach, and afterward there seem to have followed other apostles, which all taught messages that apparently contradicted that of Paul. Paul did not like this. He saw himself as a legitimate apostolic teacher in the area. In fact, they seem to impugn the very legitimacy of Paul's entire apostolic legitimacy, perhaps noting the most glaring fact about it and, well, him. Paul never knew Jesus in life. He seems to have written several letters to this fledgling community at Corinth, one of which became 1 Corinthians, others of which are lost, including the famed Letter of Tears, and fragments of others were stitched together to form what we now call 2 Corinthians. And it's at 2 Corinthians 12 that Paul reveals something utterly extraordinary. The mystical vision that may very well have been at the foundation of his very mission to the Gentiles. Again, the context here is that it appears that Paul is in a dispute over his legitimacy as an apostle of Jesus. His major obstacle, of course, being that he didn't know Jesus during Jesus' lifetime. Thus, he never heard the actual teachings of Jesus directly from the horse's mouth or the Messiah's mouth. He didn't receive a formal charge to preach the way that perhaps Peter did, the message of the fledgling Jesus movement, and if we're to trust Paul, he was actively part of an attempt to violently suppress the movement early on, something that earned him the distrust of the early apostles. Thus, Paul is at pains to establish the legitimacy of what he'd been doing for the past 14 years, preaching the salvific gospel of Jesus the Christ, especially to non-Jews. And in order to do so, to establish that very authority, Paul seems to reveal a secret. Something so esoteric that even he conceals his own identity in the first few lines. But to really appreciate it, let's quote the entire section of 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 12. Paul writes, "It is necessary to boast. Nothing is to be gained by it, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord, optasias kai apocalypsis curio. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, arpegenta heos tritu orio. Whether in the body or not in the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that such a person, again, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows, was caught up to paradise, hirpagii eston paradison, and heard things that are unutterable, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. Arita hermita auk ezon anthropo lalisai. On behalf of such a one, I will boast, but not on my own behalf. I will not boast, except out of my own weakness. But I wish to boast. I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth. For I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me, even considering the exceptional character of these revelations. Kai te herpubole ton apocalypsion. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in my flesh, an angel of Satan to torment me. Edothe moi skolops te sarki angolo satana hine me koliphazi. To keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it might leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more, glad of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. There I am content with weaknesses, with insults, with hardships, with persecutions and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. I have been a fool. You forced me to it. Indeed, you should have been the ones commending me. For I am not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. The signs of the true apostle were performed among you with the utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. This passage may well be one of the most extraordinary in the entire New Testament. In an effort to establish the legitimacy of Paul's very role as an apostle, he invokes a mystical experience he apparently underwent some 14 years prior. In fact, he seems positively tortured. Well, Paul's always kind of tortured about something, isn't he? He's the emo apostle, if there ever was one. But yes, he's tortured to even bring it up at all, it appears. Note that as he starts to describe the experience, he can't bring himself to name that it was actually him, Paul, that had the experience in the first place, and it is only a few lines in that he begins to claim the vision, hesitatingly, as his own. But at this point, the main point is that Paul's revealing to the Corinthians that he underwent a profound mystical vision which Paul himself takes to underwrite his entire vocation as an apostle of Christ over and against to what he deridingly refers to as the super apostles, or sometimes the apostles of Satan. This is a good metal band. But despite the highly elliptical nature of what his mystical disclosure was, what are we to make of this mystical vision? And where do we locate it in Paul's spiritual journey as an apostle of Jesus the Christ? Let's tackle these two questions in turn. Now, you'd think that it would go without saying that if we want to understand Paul's mystical experiences, we might just turn to historical Jewish sources of the time, or, near abouts, considering, Jesus and his followers, including Paul, they were all Jewish, precisely until Paul began his ministry to the Gentiles. And if you thought that, you are already ahead of nearly 1900 years of previous scholarship on these verses. I'm not kidding. So far as I can tell, not a single scholar prior to 1901 even thought to ask the question, and what is probably the single most historically decisive mystical experience ever experienced in some ways, went basically fundamentally misunderstood since it occurred in the 40s of the Common Era. It's only been since the 20th century, really starting in the 1980s, that scholars have reluctantly even begun to put a spotlight on the esoteric and apocalyptic character of Paul's mysticism and how his mysticism was absolutely decisive in his religious trajectory. In fact, centuries of especially Protestant scholarship systematically sidelined this mystical element of Paul's vocation in a spectacularly biased and frankly stupid attempt to make Paul out to be a kind of proto-humanist Lutheran, detached from all that icky, superstitious Catholic nonsense, papistry, much less understanding him as a Jewish mystic. Gott in Himmel, nein. But thanks to pioneering scholarship by folks like Schaeffer, Siegel, Tabor, Maury Jones, and others through the late 80s and 90s till now, we now have a much firmer grasp on what the nature of the mysticism that Paul's referring to and how it seems to have set the foundations for the very earliest elements of Christian theology. Yeah, I think it's that important. So, what if I told you that a surviving apocalyptic and mystical literature from the centuries around Paul's lifetime actually described people ascending into supernal realms, really descending into them, hearing strange, unutterable words before glimpsing the divine glory and being transformed into quasi-angelic beings? Yeah, Paul seems to have been an adept of this mystical tradition, now known to scholars as Merkavah Mysticism or Hechalot Mysticism, the Merkavah being the divine chariot throne upon which the divine glory, or the kavod, rests, and the Hechalot referring to the supernal palaces of the temple-like heavenly realm. Now, to be sure, visionary accounts of the divine realm in Jewish lore occur well before this period in the early apocalyptic literature, especially in the visions of Isaiah and Ezekiel, and to a lesser degree, Daniel. But later literature would greatly expand this genre, including, of course, famously the books of Enoch, which detail positively elaborate journeys through the heavens and hell, the Gehinnom, and the transformation of Enoch into a kind of quasi-angelic being before other, even more radical literature has him being transformed into the hyper-angel. I'm going to go to hyper-angel Metatron, even being referred to in 3 Enoch as Yahweh HaKatan, the lower or the little Yahweh. So there's that. I've done a whole episode about 3rd Enoch if you want to dive into that wonderfully weird text. However, what isn't clear from these texts of the apocalyptic period is the degree to which they are just narrative, mere narrative, or narrative downstream of phenomenology. That is to say, narratives actually informed by mystical experiences. Now, in my opinion, and you can take it for what it's worth, is that this literature is, in some substantial way, informed by mystical experiences and represents the literary uptake of just those experiences. Even transformation into angels is already something attested in Philo, a Platonic philosopher, something that actually likely happens to Moses in the literature of the time. And there was even a literature recovered at both Qumran and Masada that includes hymns to be read by people as if they were angels, transformed into angels, surrounding the very Chariot-Throne of God on Shabbat. We have lots of manuscripts of this. It seems to have been popular. So certainly in Paul's day, there was an abundance of mystical ascent literature, and the concept of being transformed into a glorified angel-like being before the Chariot-Throne of God was absolutely in currency. Paul would have known about this literature at least. Further, and even more to the point, rabbinical sources from around the period just after Paul, but again, surely expressing speculation and mystical practices that go back earlier, probably to his lifetime at least, discuss to whom such mystical techniques can be taught, which means they were being taught, and a tale about the perils of the ascent itself. Now, I keep again saying ascent, but the literature actually always refers to it as a descent, typically. The people are referred to as Yordei Merkavah, the descenders to the chariot. But in the Mishnah, a compilation of Jewish lore and mostly law, redacted around 200 of the Common Era, records the following prohibition at Chagiga 2:1. It is not permitted to expound upon forbidden sexual relationships with even 3 people, nor the matter of creation, Ma'aseh Bereshit, with 2, nor the chariot, the Merkavah, with even a single individual, unless he were wise, Chacham, and understands from his own knowledge, Midato, from his own knowledge. Whoever meditates upon 4 things, it would be fitting if he had never even come into the world. What is above, what is below, what was before, and what will be afterwards. And whoever is not careful about the glory, the kavod of the Creator, it would also be fitting that he should not have ever come into the world. While the Mishnah is, again, rather elliptic here, like most Mishnayot, hence the need for an entire commentary literature that becomes the entirety of the Talmuds, there are 2, it's clearly expressing a prohibition on expounding certain topics to students, with more sensitive topics requiring increasingly restricting the audience. The matter of creation, or Ma'aseh Bereshit, is probably speculation about the origins of the Olam, the cosmos, something that actually gets speculated on at length in the famed and mysterious Sefer Yetzirah, a text likely composed on the margins of rabbinical circles, kind of para-rabbinic literature. But the prohibition on the Merkavah, or the divine chariot throne, provides us with 2 conditions, aside from the restriction on the audience. One, that a person would be a chakam, or a wise person, probably an indication of strict rabbinical ordination. You need to be already up there to do this ascent, along with having had understanding from his own knowledge. That second qualification that one requires one to have da'at. This is a term that at the time, and kind of still today, including in the Dead Sea Scrolls back then, often implies esoteric insider knowledge. Now, this might refer to either first-hand experience of the mystical ascent. You can only talk shop with people that have been on the same mystical journey as you, or at least they have gained some preliminary knowledge from these mystical journeys, which are recorded in the literature that circulated among these groups. We'll come back to that literature in just a moment. Further, we learned that it would have been best for people not to have even come into the world at all than to engage in certain kinds of speculation about the world and not taking care about the divine glory or the kavod. Notice that the attention paid to the kavod of God is certainly important, right? And that's a technical term, and it represents the visual element of that which is beheld at the very apex of this apocalyptic mystical experience. Indeed, it was the witnessing of the kavod in much of this literature that does the work of transforming one into something akin to an angel in this form of mysticism. And again, one last thing, keep that wording. It would have been fitting that had he not ever come into the world in mind when it comes to this kind of mystical speculation. It's going to matter a lot in just a moment. Further, we learn from the Tosefta, a literature composed around the same time as the Mishnah, maybe a little later, of the perils of these mystical ascents. So we learn, 4 men went into Pardes: Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. One looked and died. One looked and was stricken. One looked and cut the shoots. One went up in peace and came down in peace. The Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds will later greatly expand upon this tale, but the core of it is this. 4 men mystically ascended into the Pardes. This is a Persian loan word into Hebrew or Aramaic. Actually, it's a word for garden, but the English word paradise actually comes from the same Persian word, a kind of supernal divine realm. There they encounter something that kills Ben Azai, drives Ben Zoma insane, and causes Acher, the other one, this is a deprecating term, title for the arch-heretic Elisha ben Abuya, to become an apostate, with only Akiva, the sole rabbi, or Chacham in this case, emerging safely. Recall the prohibition on not teaching this stuff to non-Chachamim. It looks like Rabbi Akiva took them on a journey they weren't ready for. Again, all of these men were real historical personages in the period of what is called the Tanaim, the period of the folks that composed the Mishnah. In other lore, we learn what they encountered that led to their death and insanity was a kind of illusion where the pure marble pavement of heaven, perhaps actually composed of Ezekiel's chashmal, can be mistaken for water. Ben Azai and Ben Zoma making precisely the mistake. They mistaked it for water. This killed Ben Azai and it drove Ben Zoma insane. The texts refer to Ben Zoma as being outside for the rest of his life in a kind of detached trance. Elisha ben Abuya's mistake is even more dangerous. He seemed to have actually escaped the water illusion, and he actually ends up gazing upon the divine throne. He makes it to the final boss. But when he sees there, it drives him to heresy. 1 hour a day, Metatron, the angel Metatron, was allowed to sit upon the divine throne and record the merits of Eretz Israel. Knowing that sitting in the supernal realms wasn't allowed, Elisha concludes, there must have been 2 powers in heaven, a form of heretical Jewish bitheism that inspired absolute dread in the rabbinical imagination. That bitheism might have been at the very core of this whole business with Metatron being Yahweh HaKatan, or the lesser Yahweh, and that over in the Gnostic world of the demiurgic speculations of the time, where you get a kind of dual god, one good and one evil. It might also be at the very core of Pauline theology and the near identity of the divine glory, or kavod, with Jesus the Christ. More on that in a moment. Regardless, that this kind of mystical ascent was being performed by central rabbinical figures such as Akiva, sometime in the early 2nd century, pushes back the profound likelihood that Paul's mystical experience in 2 Corinthians should be located precisely in this esoteric form of Jewish ascent and its speculative literature of the Ta'anitic period. Now, this is all the more confirmed, at least to my mind, by actually looking at the volumes of Merkavah Hechelot text that were actually produced by these mystics. Yeah, some of them survive, though, again, from a later period, mostly redacted in the 3rd century, but probably representing earlier practices and speculation, and surviving in 50 manuscripts of some length. This literature contains a truly complicated collection of visionary narratives, yoga-like techniques, of mystical ascent, magical-like literature, and even documentation of the vast dimensions of the divine body, the physical kavod of God. In fact, in one of these texts, the ascent narrative of Rabbi Akiva I just described a moment ago is actually found in that text, probably in an older version in the first person, as described by Akiva himself. Though, in that text, the other 4 ascenders, descenders, they go unnamed. Again, this may be testimony that despite the later redaction of these texts, these do preserve material from a much, much older period. Now, I've done a whole episode on the Merkavah Hechelot literature pretty early on in the channel's history. Kind of want to go back and redo some of those early episodes, but if you want to check it out for a basic introduction to that literature, you may want to check it out there. But suffice to say, this literature only really truly appeared and was appreciated in the 20th century by scholars, with the first critical edition only appearing in the 1980s. And I think it substantially aids in clarifying Paul's 2 Corinthian vision and maybe Paul's entire mystical theology. Let's see how. Paul describes being taken up into paradise, or the 3rd heaven. Paradise, or the Pardes, we've just seen in the Tosefta narrative about the 4 descenders. The 3rd heaven here is interesting, given that most of the later Merkavah texts tend to speak of an inwardly nested 7-tier heaven. You can think of the Hechelot as kind of like a Russian doll made of heaven. But earlier, more apocalyptic Enochic texts actually do imagine the supernal realm to be structured like the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, with an outer courtyard, an inner holy place, and an even interior Holy of Holies. And thus, they do imagine a threefold structure to the supernal realms. I wouldn't be surprised if Paul, given that he lived during the days of the temple and employed an earlier structure of the heavens in the later Merkavah text, thus his paradise, or Pardes, in the 3rd heaven, would have been the apex of the ascent into the heavenly Holy of Holies, where the kavod, or glory of God, is said to have dwelled upon the Chariot-Throne. That he can't tell whether he was taken up physically or spiritually is also keen. The Merkavah ascenders seem to always describe their ascent and movement through the divine palaces as if they were physically there, that they could be physically killed, they could be physically incinerated, literally walking around and seeing things just like I'm seeing a camera. That Paul can't decide seems to perfectly match the phenomenological reports left by other descenders. They also probably couldn't tell whether they were there physically or otherwise. Further, that Paul also heard unutterable things is also matched in the literature, especially in a text referred to as Hechelot Zutarti, where the ascent is coupled with hearing angelic and divine voices, Bat Kol perhaps, uttering strange names of God in long strings of Hebrew Aramaic. These strange names are nomina barbara, fill the Hechelot literature, and scholars to this day, we still have no idea what these long strings of Aramaic or Hebrew words are meant to be at all, perhaps the language of the angels. Paul also seems to have imagined himself as being somehow split during the ascent. But while his lower earthly Paul self can't boast, his higher Paul self, perhaps the transformed self or the Ascent self, can. This transformation of the self into a higher angelic-like form is frankly part and parcel of the Hechel literature. In fact, it appears to me proximity through trust, or pistis, sometimes rendered as faith in the New Testament, to Christ that initiates the regeneration of the self into a glorified state is directly from this literature. It seems that identity with this Christ as kavod, as the divine glory, is the ultimate goal of this very early stratum of Pauline theology. In fact, I'd argue, Paul's vision of Jesus as the divine kavod, which is transforming or glorifying believers, even as he writes, into angelic-like beings already in this life, is a remarkable reflection of themes precisely from Hechel literature. Further, it seems that what Paul has in mind is a kind of democratization of this transformatory power. In the rabbinical version, only the elites, the chachamim, the rabbis, can make this journey. Other folks don't fare so well. But it appears that Paul imagines Jesus having made this extremely powerful journey and has extended the boon of having made that journey to all who believe in him, who all have pistis, trust in him. Thus, common people will also be transformed into eternal glorified beings through their pistis, through their trust, their faith in Christ. A transformation once only available to the esoteric rabbinical elites, the adepts, and them only at great peril of their physical and mental well-being. Though, as for Paul's boasting, Rabbi Ishmael famously warns against boasting as well, about this mystical ascent and what you gain from it. This prohibition is about discussing the ascent, much less about boasting about it, seems to be at the very heart of Paul's reticence to discuss it at all. Oh yeah, speaking of that peril, the Hechel literature is filled to the brim with tales of the extreme danger one faces in the mystical ascent, from absolutely Mortal Kombat level gruesome death and insanity-inducing illusions like the water illusion I mentioned earlier, to the non-stop barrage of fierce angelic guardians that gladly massacre the unworthy. Such angels can only be bypassed with special symbols and magical code words, which only the most experienced ascenders even had access to at all. Among the most furious of the angelic defenders were the Malachei HaChabbalah, Kabbalah, not Kabbalah. These are the angels of destruction who threaten to variously incinerate the ascenders, or my favorite image, to husk them like sheaves of grain. I suspect that the angel of Satan that Paul refers to may very well have been one of these fierce defending angels, these Malachei HaChabbalah of the divine palaces, who in fact afflicted him with the thorn in his flesh. These are not the kind gentle angels you normally think of. And remember the similar language of the four ascenders from the Tosefta. We remember that Ben Zoma chetzitz v'nifga, that Ben Zoma gazed and was struck. We can have the meaning of physically struck, but it can also mean, paga can also mean to be struck mentally or to go insane. And that's precisely what we learn about Ben Zoma in later literature. There's even a moment when Akiva, the Chacham Akiva, is almost sure to be struck down by one of these horrifying angels before he appeals directly to the divine kavod in desperation, who directly intercedes for him, calling down the angelic warrior, commanding, "Let the old man, the Zakan, let the old man, let the elder, let him be." Finally, in addition to Paul's vision, he also claims to have performed signs and wonders and mighty works to prove his apostolic credibility to the Corinthians, very much in parallel with many of the supernatural powers said to have been gained by the adepts of the Ascent literature. They all seem to be utterly transformed and gain quasi-angelic powers through their ascent. In fact, the Hechel literature very closely parallels Jewish magical texts of late antiquity, such as the Sefer HaRazim, the Sarah-Torah literature, which is literally appended to many texts in the Hechel literature, and the Charba de Moshe, which in turn very closely parallel the wider world of Greco-Egyptian magic, which is full of invocation, ritual words of power, magical signs, passwords, nomina barbara, and a wide range of powerful invocations, incantations, and evocations. The world of the Merkavah literature is bound up inextricably with this literature. Paul claims to have gained such powers would have been very much aligned with other miracle workers of the time as well, including the whole list of Galilean Anshe Ma'aseh, or men of miraculous deeds, people like Choni the circle maker, who could force God to make it rain, Chanina ben Dosa, whose wife simply became accustomed to miracles, Jesus of Nazareth, let's not forget him, kind of an important player in all this, and of course eventually Shimon Bar Yochai, who had laser power eyes. If you want to learn more about these miracle workers, I've made an entire episode just about them, and it's especially interesting to compare them to Jesus' own miracle working career, because Jesus wasn't the only Galilean dude out there doing miracles. Thus, even Paul's claim to have performed such apparently magical feats are also bound up with the literature of Jewish esoteric mystical ascent, and the magical literature often, frankly, very proximate to it. Thus, given what we know now, I think at least part of the mystery of Paul's 2 Corinthian mystical vision can finally be solved. He was very likely part of this cadre of Jewish mystics engaged in ascents into the divine palaces, or the chechalot, bypassing powerful angelic guardians, one of which Paul might not have bypassed very well, to gain witness to the divine glory, or kavod, sitting upon the Chariot-Throne, or the Merkavah, in the hopes of being transformed into one of these angelic-like beings, either temporarily in the vision trance state, or through some further pneumatic transformation, more esoteric still. Further, the metaphysical transformation of the ascender was also tied by Paul, both the exalted state of Jesus the Christ as the divine kavod, or glory, but he also seems to have thought of Jesus' specific ascent as the ascent to end all ascents, the precursor for a final transformation of all believers into an eternal, glorified state. Thus, these early and yet major elements of Christian theology and soteriology are directly tied to Paul's earlier career as a Merkavah mystic. On the one hand, this should be utterly shocking. But on the other hand, what else should we expect than Paul's theology, Christology, and soteriology to be informed by the actual historical Jewish speculations and mystical practices of his day? Of course, Paul's genius was to repackage them around his own mystical revelation of the messianic and salvific power of Jesus the Christ. But the fundamental elements from which he would forge Christianity, he seems to have found in the mystical ascent speculation and practices of late Second Temple period Judaism. Though, to be sure, this was only the Jewish form of mystical ascent. Other forms existed as well. This was very popular, most famously perhaps in the Hermetic literature and in the early versions of the books of you. This is the "but wait, there's more" moment. I think all of this goes even deeper, that the vision recounted by Paul in 2 Corinthians might have been even more profoundly decisive in world history than we've already detailed. Recall the when, the why, and the to whom that this recounting of the mystical experience is happening at all. It occurred 14 years prior. He's recounting it to reinforce the legitimacy of his apostolic role, especially among the Corinthians, specifically, but also as a true representative of the Jesus movement more generally. And the to whom? I don't think it's Jews over there in Corinth, but to Gentile believers. Of course, reconstructing Paul's life and his movement around the Mediterranean basin is notoriously difficult, but I think something very important is happening here. If we rewind 14 years from 2 Corinthians, I have a sense of very well where we might end up. We might end up with Paul in Jerusalem, right around the time of another mystical vision, maybe the same one he had in which Jesus first sent him to be an apostle among the Gentiles. Recall that in 2 Corinthians, Paul describes this vision right after describing his escape early on right after his conversion from Damascus. A potentially reconstructed timeline would have Paul on the Damascus Road conversion several years, 5 or 6 years after the execution of Jesus, spending some amount of time in Damascus and Arabia, whatever that means, before making his way to Jerusalem for the first time to meet with and probably learn from members of the Jesus movement. Remember, he never met Jesus, and apparently to preach the truth of it to the Jews there. Paul probably being, frankly, the most learned convert that the movement had gotten up to that point. Now, the book of Acts is as much Greco-Roman romance as it is history, probably more the former than the later half the time, but I think Luke does record an incredibly important moment, a very important real historical moment at Acts 22, even if the details are literary fiction. There, at the temple, Paul is presenting his newly found faith through testimony, such that, and I'm quoting from Acts 22 here, Paul writes, "After I had returned to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. Genesthai me en ektase. I saw Jesus, and he said to me, 'Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.' And I said, 'Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And while the blood of your witness,'" the word martyr, Stephen, "'was shed, I myself was standing by, approving and keeping the coats of those who killed him away. And then Jesus said to me, Go, for I will send you far away among the Gentiles. Hoti ego es ethni makran exapostelemo se." You can hear the word apostle to the nations. This moment is truly decisive in world religious history. Just world history, frankly. This is the moment that Paul abandons any attempt to spread the Jesus movement, exclusively among Jews, and expands his missionary agenda to include non-Jews. This is the mission to the Gentiles. The importance of this moment cannot be overstated. Even if Paul had converted to the Jesus movement, and it had remained only a movement by Jews, for Jews, the way that it was up until this revolutionary, ecstatic, by Paul's own admission, his own ecstatic vision, Christianity would have frankly never become a world religion. If it survived at all, it would have just been another minor sect of an already minor religion. Jews make up less than 1% of the world's population or something. But this mystical vision in which Jesus commands Paul to go among the Gentiles would truly transform world history. You can also see why I just can't hide my frustration and contempt for that long history of scholars that have attempted to sideline the importance of Paul's mystical experiences. It's a positively decisive linchpin in this story. But if this analysis holds, and I think that it might, I think that it does, and it's surely worth contemplating even if you don't think it doesn't, the vision expounded in 2 Corinthians and the Jerusalem vision to go among the Gentiles may very well be the same vision. Now, Acts is notoriously unreliable as history, but I think that it does capture something of real history here. Why? Because of how the Jewish crowd, the Pharisees at the temple, react. They shout something to the effect of, "Remove this person from the world, for it's not fitting for him to live." Now recall that line. That line's interesting. Think back to the Mishnah, one of our earliest non-Paul, Paul's our earliest, but our non-Paul statements about Jewish mysticism, the Merkavah Mysticism. Whoever meditates upon 4 things, it will be fitting had he not come into the world. What is above, what is below, what was before, and what will come afterwards. And whoever is not careful about the kavod of the Creator. Remember, Paul unites the kavod of Jesus with God. It would be fitting had he never come into the world. That line, that it would be fitting that he had never come into the world, it really stands out to me as a unique intersection between Paul's mystical vision, his early theology, and the language of condemnation found in the Mishnah for precisely Merkavah-like speculations, especially heresies around the misuse of the kavod. It's also something that the Gentile writer Luke, he wouldn't have known the first thing about unless this whole episode was recounted to him by a Jewish person, specifically a Jewish mystic for whom such an insult was perhaps especially painful. Of course, also this is all happening at the temple. That's incredibly important. The Pardes that Paul was caught up to in the third heaven, that was the Holy of Holies in the celestial temple where perhaps he encountered Christ as the divine kavod. The parallelism, a classic trope of Hebrew literature, is just striking. In fact, this whole section has hardcore Isaiah 6 vibes, where Paul is actually being sent to the Gentiles to purify them, as opposed to Isaiah's mission to his corrupt Israelite brethren. Finally, that Paul would invoke a mystical vision he had in Jerusalem about Jesus as the divine kavod, sending him among the Gentiles, would be the absolute nuclear option to prove the legitimacy of his apostolic vocation among the Corinthians and the wider world. It's literally his divinely mandated vocation in life. So, take that, super apostles. Thus, if all this holds, even a bit, we must come to a truly startling conclusion. A form of ancient Jewish Ascent mysticism was responsible for Paul's mission to the Gentiles and underwrote the earliest elements of Christian theology, Christology, and soteriology, his theory of salvation. If true, I think it is, this should represent a tectonic shift in our understanding of early Christianity, including a real profound rethinking of the relationship between Paul and Jesus. That it was the Merkavah mystic Paul that took the life and teachings of a executed apocalyptic preacher, even the concept of the Messiah itself, and radically transformed them into a true world religion, eventually. In the same way that previous generations of Paul scholars have actually tried to downplay Paul's chops as a real mystic to make him, a humanist Lutheran or something, something's actually similarly happened in esoteric circles I've noticed, which I think is really unfortunate. While Jesus is praised as the adept to end all adepts, all the terrible, terrible things that are true of Christianity are just placed at the feet of Paul. This is equally misguided. I would argue just the opposite is probably the case. Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher, first and foremost, but it was Paul that was a mystic, first and foremost. And indeed, we see that very truth in the writings, in his writings and the writings about him in the New Testament. And those writings that contain these mystical experiences are now backed by actual mystical Jewish texts from the Second Temple period and the late classical world. Paul was a mystic, and it appears that his very Jewish Merkavah mysticism, it changed the world forever. Now, of course, this isn't a theory I've just come up with on my own, far from it. There has been a mountain of extremely important scholarship since the studies on the Hechelot mysticism in early Christianity began to appear really in earnest in the 1980s and the 1990s following the publication of the critical edition of the Hechelot Merkavah text. At this point, there is an amazing amount of literature on the topic, including extraordinarily specialized monographs by Siegel and Schaeffer and Tabor, Maury Jones, Arbel, de Vella, who's translated all of, or at least a major text of the Merkavah tradition in English, along with many, many others. I'm going to put a list of scholars and volumes that I think you might want to start with in the description if you want to pursue this line of thinking for yourself. Not that you should accept what I'm saying, just consider it. In fact, I'm actually thinking about teaching an entire class on Merkavah mysticism because I think it's just that important. If you're interested in taking a class on Merkavah mysticism, let me know in the comments. Until next time, thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.